Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I am your host, Tara Stubbs. This episode, my guest is Carol Jacobi. Thank you very much, Carol, for joining us.
Thanks, it's lovely to be in Oxford again.
Dr. Carol Jacobi is curator of British art 1850 to 1915 at Tate Britain, but works across periods including modern and contemporary. She publishes and broadcasts widely. Her most recent exhibition is the Rossettis at Tate Britain and the Delaware Art Museum. Carol is committed to looking afresh at historic art through 21st century perspectives and at research with a special interest in art by women. She has taught at Birkbeck and at the Courtauld Institute and has held the Leverhulme Fellowship in the History of Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery. Other groundbreaking exhibitions include Van Gogh and Britain at Tate Britain, pre-Raphaelite masterpieces from the Tate, from Canberra, Milan and Budapest, Ophelia and Shanghai, painting with light, art and photography from the pre-Raphaelite to the modern age at Tate Britain, Salt and Silver, early photography, also at Tate Britain, and William Holman Hunt and the pre-Raphaelite vision, Love and Desire, Toronto, Minneapolis and Manchester. Her current project is James McNeill Whistler in 2026. So thank you so much for joining us, Carol. I really wanted to speak to you because, as you know, I went to the Rossettis exhibition at Tate Britain last summer, and I was really interested in the way it used poetry and also its focus on women figures from the pre-Raphaelite period, but particularly Christina Rossetti and Elizabeth Siddal. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about how that exhibition came about and why you chose to use poetry in it.
Art and poetry have always been entangled, but the Raphaelites, I've been working with them for many years. Most of them were painters and poets, so it's a particularly rich relationship. So it's something I was thinking about right from the beginning. What normally happens is art and poems seem to play out in different spaces. Mm. So you don't expect to find poetry in the art gallery and vice versa. And so the situation is normally you're standing in the art gallery, you're standing in front of a picture, and there'll be a label on the wall which says, "This is Ophelia from Shakespeare's play, blah, blah, blah." Or in the case of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, it's almost always the poet Dante, medieval poet Dante, told this story of Beatrice or whatever. And it's sort of a very two-dimensional way of relating the two things. It's the model is that the painting is a kind of illustration of the poem, or perhaps the poem is like a kind of key to the painting or explanation. And I think something much, much more interesting is going on. And so Ruskin, for example, he said illustrations are never illustrations. Every illustration is really another poem.
Wow,
so I think it's such a lovely way of of thinking of thinking of the illustration as a poem, but and another poem, and so I'm really interested in, there can be kind of call and response between the two, or a conversation, or an argument, or even sometimes a kind of dance, and I wanted to find a way of bringing that out as a sort of exploration of that relationship. One of the things we're doing is we're rethinking the monographic exhibition, the great male artist usually, and I really wanted to make it about the Rossetti generation. So that is Dante Gabriel, the artist and poet. Christina Rossetti is best known of this generation. Far more books have been published. You find more books about her on Amazon than her brother. Elizabeth Siddal, who married Rossetti, so was Elizabeth Rossetti, but also the older sister, Maria Rossetti, who's never really talked about, and the brother, William Michael Rossetti. So less about them, but wanted to think about this. And they were such an extraordinary generation, and that they didn't abide by any of the Victorian rules or anything. They all published, they were all bilingual, they all worked. The women remained single their entire lives. The women were pioneer social workers, when social work was just a sort of a beginning to be an idea. I mean, I don't think many people know Christina Rossetti worked for 10 years with prostituted women.
Yes.
But they were all trying to make sense of the same world, which was this, they were the first generation to live in a city with more than 1 million people. And it was actually 3 million by the time they died, London. And it was, of course, capitalism, and there's the colonial period and so on. And what they did was try to sort of work out what art was for in this new world. You know, what is the point? What's poetry for? What's a poet for? And they sort of looked at gender and power and sex and so on in this context. When I started looking at them all together, these amazing patterns arose, and you could see these sort of, you know, them thrashing out things that we're still talking about today. But in particular, love. They were thinking, what is love now in the modern age? You know, do we still marry who our parents want us to marry? What do you do if somebody's bad for you? How can we love without getting hurt? And I think I really missed a trick with this exhibition, because when it was all there and everything was on the wall, I sort of realised that love was just so powerfully running through the whole, all the work, poetry and painting, the exhibition. I should have used that as a title.
And the kind of darker sides of love as well, such as obsession.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes,
and idealism.
And this sort of emerging idea of the femme fatale, you know, love as a sort of a weapon that wounds and things like that. The other thing was that because of this really rich relationship, so I was doing an exhibition, strange thing, I was doing an exhibition about a really famous poet, slightly less famous painter poet, and an even less famous painter poet, but I really didn't want to leave the poetry out. And so I started thinking right from the beginning, how can we get the poetry in the space without making people read stuff on walls? And I'd seen a couple of contemporary installations that involved microphones hanging down from the ceiling, and when you got close to them, they kind of spoke to you.
Oh, they have those in the new Modern Literature Ireland.
Oh, really?
Place in Dublin.
Oh,
museum.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's really good. Yeah.
And so initially I thought maybe I could do this, have the microphones. But then as I looked into it, there's this new thing which is called a sound shower, where you're not aware of any kind of technology creating a sound. You literally just walk into a space where there is sound,
you start speaking,
and you walk out of it and there's no sound anymore.
Yeah.
And I'd sort of been reading things about how the ears are really close to the brain, and this incredible intimacy of someone speaking in your ear. And I don't know, I might be wrong about this. I think the sound showers, you use your cranium almost as a kind of loudspeaker or a sound box. So it's, as you know, it's a really strange experience.
Yeah, I remember them using it as well at the V&A for the David Bowie exhibition as well a few years ago.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And it's like someone's just literally talking in your ear and no one else can hear it except you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I remember you said to me, we were talking about this before, that you had some criticism for this approach as well, even though I thought it was beautiful.
I mean, I think there was a common factor to the way people reacted. Everybody reacted in a very personal way. It seemed to sort of personalise the exhibition, and some people absolutely loved it. It wasn't at all uncommon for people to cry. At the same time, some people got a real fright when this person's suddenly speaking to them, and some people really didn't like it. And we did make the decision to also have the poems on the walls, very, very big, so you could read them from the other side of the wall.
Yes, the font was very large, wasn't it?
And actually that was really good, because some people just much prefer to read poetry than listen to it.
I wonder whether it's possibly to do with the way that some people are able to take in visual art in a slightly more passive way, and that poetry being brought to you like that is more intimate or something, might make you a bit uncomfortable maybe.
Yeah, it was physical, and that's what I hadn't been quite prepared for. But it was almost it was a physical effect on the visitor's body, which normally it's sculpture that does that, or you know, an immersive space. And I did want it to be an immersive space. I just wanted to start the exhibition with the most famous Rossetti, with a woman, which doesn't happen that often with historic.
She is the most famous Rossetti, you're right.
Just literally immerse people in her poetry.
And we were talking, I think, before about how Rossetti's poem Remember Me is one of the most used at funerals, for example, isn't it?
And Remember Me was one of those poems, and that was the one that tended to make people cry because it reminded them of a funeral.
Of course, yeah, of course.
But it was interesting that we got the demographic of the exhibition changed slightly, and we got a lot of late teens people. And of course that's because Christina Rossetti's on every school syllabus.
That's right, yeah.
And so that was lovely. That was really, really nice.
One of my favourite poems of all time is Christina Rossetti's In an Artist Studio. Absolutely love that poem. And that was very prominent, wasn't it? I think towards the end or midway through the
I mean, that was one of my favourite moments.
Yeah.
Because what it allowed to do, so we had this initial immersive space, but we also were able just to set up a few moments later in the exhibition where you could actually explore a much more intriguing relationship between the art and the poetry. And one of those places was a room in which we assembled, so I think there was probably about 20 portraits of Elizabeth Siddal in the exhibition, but one in which we assembled a whole series, including the last drawing Rossetti ever did of her, which had never been shown before. And then to be able to look at that wall, and having already seen so many of her, and to hear in your ears in an artist's studio, which is one of the things that really excites me, is obviously our values are not the same as Victorian values, and we're very often finding ourselves framing them in quite a critical way. But when you actually find a contemporary, an actual Victorian critiquing, and she just, I mean, she's so pointed, and she just, points out that, out of every painting, it's the same face, she says.
Same face looks out from all these canvases.
That's right. And then she just deconstructs that, and she shows you, and she points out that he's painting her as he sees her in his dreams, not as she really is.
And I think often that, you talked about love earlier, that poem is often read as a love poem because it's a sonnet.
Yeah.
And people don't really notice the context, which is actually probably about a brother painting a sister as well. And not just painting Rossetti, of course, but painting other women all the same as well, I suppose.
Yes.
You've got Jane Morris as well. And
later on.
But I thought that it's really interesting because you were saying that lots of people do study her at school, but I think sometimes some of the subtleties are missed. And you brought those out really well, I think, in the exhibition.
I mean, the thing that really struck me about Christina, so both Christina and her brother, they put these sort of rhetorical religious words into their poems, and actually, if you just ignore them, they're so earthy, they're so modern, they're so human, and also so visual.
Yeah, particularly something like Goblin Market, so squelchy, isn't it?
Exactly. and people don't know what to do with it because they, in their mind, they've got this, and people often talk about Christina Rossetti, she never married, as though that was a failure in her life or something, as though she wasn't sensually aware or interested in love. And then you read the Goblin Market, and I think it's one of the most, I'm going to use the word sensual, I think I mean more than that, poems I've ever read.
And you
definitely. Just don't know, you can't, it's like, does not compute. This is this poem, this is how we think of Christina Rossetti. And I think you only have to conclude that we're thinking about Christina Rossetti in quite a reductive way.
And also I think when you know that she worked with prostituted women,
that
must come through in that poem.
One of the things I love, and one of the things they have in common, patterns that emerged, is I love about Christina Rossetti is the way she uses popular language, earthy language, kind of language you'd associate with a musical or ballads.
Or street sellers.
Or street sellers, because she was hearing a lot of that in this home for prostituted women. And she puts that in her poems.
Just to change the subject slightly, I've always been really interested by the way that the Pre-Raphaelites often have the poems around the frames of the paintings. What do you think about that from a kind of art history point of view?
I think they needed sound showers.
They probably did.
I think it's obviously that they're thinking about medieval art and writing, inscriptions and images are interlaced because, obviously artists abandon that way, trying to make it look as though you're looking through a window at a real thing. And so that there is a precedent for it, but I think they are really interested in the relationship between the two, and of course most famously Dante Gabriel Rossetti's double work of art, where the poem and the painting are actually quite critical of each other and complicate each other and contradict each other. Another one of the lovely moments in the exhibition was where you could stand and listen to Lilith, which is another sonnet, while you were looking at the painting Lilith. And I think it really brought it to life. Everyone talks about Pre-Raphaelite hair, don't they? But I see if I've got the lines. So she's an early example of one of these femme fatales that we mentioned earlier. And the scholarship shows low, as that youth's eyes burned at thine, the sonnete's address to Lilith. So went thy spell through him, and left his straight back neck bent, and round his heart one strangling golden hair. And suddenly you kind of see the hair from more points of view.
So for you, do you think this was a really good opportunity to explore your own interest in the relationship between visual art and poetry?
Yeah.
Would there be any other examples that you can think of that because I always think the pre-Raphaelites kind of dominate that argument sometimes, don't they, that relationship?
Yeah, but I think there's still a long way to go with exploring that relationship. I feel like the Rossettis was just the beginning of a journey. There's just so much, there's relationship between Aeschylus and work of his own time, or Francis Bacon, or Louis MacNeice, or whatever. Yes, I think it's something that is really interesting.
Do you think that sometimes art historians can be slightly hierarchical about what the value is of something like painting over poetry, or not really?
I don't think so. I think it's more about the vehicle that you're working with. So in a Walter Benjamin-ish kind of way, if you're working in an art gallery with visual objects and you're arranging them in a room, they're going to, it's going to be more difficult to think about how stories, texts, poems.
Yes. Because it's about how they occupy space, I suppose.
And how you activate them.
And as you were saying earlier, like they can be quite private things, poems, and I suppose you were bringing them into the public.
Yes.
In a slightly different way.
Yeah. But we had an amazing exhibition at Tate Britain last year. Lynette Iedon Boachi,
I saw that one,
and she is a painter poet, and the poetry worked in those spaces just in a very, very simple way, in that her titles, each title is like a one-line poem, and her titles just sort of energized and activated and complicated her paintings in the most lovely way. And that was just a very simple thing.
So it's kind of almost like a reading of the poem.
Or just made you looked at the painting, then you looked at the title and went, oh, okay, and you rethought the painting. So I think, it's, there are ways to do it. I mean, one of the things we've been experimenting with is active interpretation, where you actually have a poet in the space interpreting the painting, literally speaking poetry, as part of just the everyday exhibition.
When you were planning this, did anybody think, oh, this wouldn't be a good idea? Did you meet anything like that?
It was a huge learning curve. Nobody really knew if it was going to work. So it worked beyond my wildest expectations. Yes, and there was a lot of sort of technical things to unravel. And actually, I think we sort of developed the way these sound showers are used, and I think they're going to carry on being used.
Great. I love that phrase, sound shower. That's really nice. Could you say a little bit more about your personal relationship with poetry and how you...
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever thought I was interested in poetry because it's sort of something that sort of seemed to have a capital P, you know what I mean? But actually, when I sort of stopped to think about it, actually I think poems have been waylaying me for as long as I can remember. And I remember, I would get really overwhelmed by certain things. So Rudyard Kipling's The Smuggler's Song, watch the wall, my darling, as the gentlemen go by, or that tomorrow and tomorrow. I still get goosey pimples with the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow line from Macbeth. And I used to go and copy them out painstakingly and make these little books sort of, tied together with wool and things.
That's lovely.
And so then I think I even had a go at writing some, but they were so awful. I'm not just being modest, they were absolutely terrible. And I think then later, I think I was very aware of the wonderful poetry of song lyrics. I think everyone is when they're a teenager. And I came across Rossetti's poems, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poems. I was just attracted by an old Victorian gold and leather little book, which I found in a basket in Cambridge. And his, the poems are so... I was like in love at the time. And the poems were so sensual, so visual. There's a description of a dragonfly, like a blue thread torn from the sky, and looking up at your lover through her hair and all sorts of things. And so that's when I've loved Rossetti's poetry ever since, and I've come to love Christina and Elizabeth Siddal. who's also a wonderful poet, through doing this exhibition.
I remember you saying to me that growing up in Birmingham, you encountered them also in the art gallery there, which is actually where I also encountered them, also growing up in Birmingham. Could you say a little bit, because I remember you said something very interesting about how you were quite nervous to go and go through that door. I mean, obviously that's changed now for you a lot, but
it's a big question that everyone's thinking about a lot now, and I presume this podcast is in a way part of that. Of how do you get people across the real or imaginary threshold to encounter poetry or art. And for me, it was simply that the art gallery is free, that it was often raining in Birmingham. I needed someone to meet my boyfriend, and eventually one day I started looking at the paintings, and we were thinking about it a lot now, and thinking about how do you get poetry, for example. And I think that the question now, the way to do it now is to take it take it to people where people are with their culture. So, for example, we had a poster campaign with the poems on, and just podcasts of social media. We had an event where it's like a lovely circular thing. I'd heard an amazing program, which I really recommend. It's another podcast, BBC one that Rachel Knowles had done, just on the kiss. It's fantastic.
Oh wow! Okay.
And of course, there's 21 kisses in this exhibition, and then we had a big event, and she did poetry readings there, and people had to go writing their own poetry, and that was really, really lovely. But I think what you said earlier. I mean, I think "Remember" is one of the most famous poems in the world because people have met it at funerals.
Yes.
And I think the poetry has to enter people's spaces. We can't just keep it in the gallery or in the poetry reading or in the slim volume.
I had one of my close friends, her sister died, unfortunately, and I remember she asked me to choose a poem to read, and in the end we went back to "Remember" because there are so few that are actually as sort of open as that poem, but also not too complicated. So many poems about death are actually either slightly abstract or slightly cruel
or sort of falsely consoling sometimes.
There's something about that poem that works, doesn't it, I think?
My understanding of that poem really grew over the period of the exhibition, and there was another trick that I missed, was that Dante Gabriel Rossetti was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Got hold of his stuff as soon as it was published. He was illustrating, the first person to illustrate him. And of course, Poe's most famous poem, The Raven, he loved it. But being 19, he thought, I'm going to do my own version of this. So Poe had the idea of somebody who just could not get over, could not stop missing their dead lover, who could not get over it to the point of insanity. Rossetti had a clever idea, I think, that perhaps the lover in heaven could not get over missing. And so he imagines her in heaven looking down at her lover on earth below. And of course, it's actually almost a bit more sinister than Poe in a way, because if she's to have her wish and be reunited with her lover, that her lover has to die for that to happen. And almost straight away, Christina, who's only 16 at the time, writes "Remember." 16. She writes "Remember," and she just takes on, Poe and her brother, and as you say, it's a much more down to earth poem, which basically essentially says, when you're dead, we don't really know what happens. You're under the ground with the dirt in your eyes and so on, and and maybe we'll remember each other, but maybe it's better if we don't. For if the darkness and corruption leave a vestige of the thoughts that once I had, better by far that you should forget and smile than that you should remember and be sad. And I just think that's
it's so much wisdom for a 16-year-old. Incredible, isn't it? And also I think that's what the exhibition conveyed really well, was her precociousness. I mean that in a positive way, that she's someone who seemed to have quite a lot of self-belief, to be able to take on, and for her poems to be critiques, in essence, of what her brother and others were doing. And
she's incredibly innovative. I mean, I think it's Walt Whitman that's normally thought of as a sort of pioneer of blank verse. But actually there's quite close connection between Whitman and the Rossettis, in that William Michael was the first person to publish Whitman in Europe. And actually, Christina's writing blank verse, and I'd love some scholar to sort of to fill me in a bit more on whether there is a connection between those things, which she's certainly doing at first. And yeah, she was really incredibly original and innovative. And I think with going back to the Goblin Market and how shocking it is to read even now, how difficult it is to fit in with this idea of this Victorian lady. But actually her brother did the illustration for it when it was published, and he turned it into like a fairy tale by turning all the goblins, who are basically metaphors for capitalism. They sell, can buy, into these cute animals.
Yes.
And I wonder what would have happened to that
Which
poem.
has led to many misreadings, I think, over time.
I wonder what would happen to that poem if he hadn't calmed it down a bit. Yeah.
So just to sort of start drawing it to a close, could you say a little bit about how you read poetry in your own time? Do you read poetry? What do you think about that practice? Or has it just become too much of your life?
I think the reason I'm keen on the idea of poetry ambushing people as they're going about their everyday life, I'm always a fan of a poem on the underground, is I think my relationship with poetry has changed through doing this exhibition and through really begin to understand Christina and Elizabeth's poems. I mean, there's just this one line which comes around and around. I'm still like a child with, just having those certain overwhelming lines, like, he wore me like a silken knot, he changed me like a glove. so good.
Throwaway. It's amazing that you did that whole exhibition on it and you still got more that you want. It feels like you still got more that you want to say.
I'm setting out to write fiction, and I'm working on a novel, and I went on one of those week-long Arvon courses last year, and if they'd said to me we would be doing poetry, I wouldn't have gone on the course. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have booked it, but when we got there we were writing poetry, and I absolutely loved it.
So they ambushed you with it.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I found it so much easier to write a poem, and more rewarding. And also, I didn't go there to explore poetry as something that would be good for my mental health, but that's certainly what happened.
And I think we're in a space now where perhaps there's more openness about what constitutes a poem as well. It's a bit more freedom because of things like Insta poetry and those kinds of things.
And going back to song lyrics and even advertising jingles and things like that, you just have to repeat something and it suddenly has a whole new meaning, so which Christine Rossetti does all the time.
Yeah, she does.
Snow on snow on snow and in the Fleetwood Minter. But, I was thinking about Brian Eno, I'll come running to tie your shoe. I'll come running to tie your shoe. The second one is what makes it the poetry.
Oh, you're right, that's true. So I'm asking the same final question to everyone, which is, for someone wanting to get into poetry, do you have a poem or a poet or a collection you would recommend?
So this is difficult for me because I would never go and buy a collection, and I'm thinking, have I? And yet, I there's so many wonderful poets that I would say I would recommend poets.
Yeah, that's fine.
I like Louis MacNeice.
I love Louis MacNeice.
Christina Rossetti. I mean, again, one of the things that brought poetry into my life was in my 20s when I had a child. Suddenly I was reading Michael Rosen and all those sort of kind of things.
So you think it's different poems for different stages?
Different poems in different places when you're doing different things, I think. A poem like Nuptial Sleep by Rossetti, which was the one that caught my attention as a teenager in the old Victorian book with the sort of very thin paper. I think Nuptial Sleep is a poem to go and look at. Because the last line is just so it's a very sensual poem about a couple on their wedding night finishing making love and not being quite finished and then falling asleep, and the last line, when he wakes up he's having these amazing dreams, but he's even more amazed that when he wakes up she's there. And that's just I think lovely. I don't know if that's only a poem for teenagers, but
So thank you so much, Carol. If people want to find out more about some of the things we've been talking about today, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, there's some wonderful podcasts came out of the exhibition. I recommend the Pre-Raphaelite Society. They do wonderful podcasts about all aspects of the Pre-Raphaelites, but in the context of this, they did a wonderful one looking at Christina Rossetti's poetry through an LGBTQ plus lens, Natalie Reeve. Mm-hmm. They did a wonderful one looking at Christina as a carer and the interrelation between her role as a carer from the age of 12, so she was a young carer, by Diana Rowe. Mm-hmm. And I recommend Rachel Noel's BBC podcast about the kiss. So there's wonderful things. You can look at the poems, and you can come and look at the paintings. Still, many of them are on display for free permanently at Tate Britain.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our listeners, and I'll see you next time on Demystifying Poetry.